Order, order. Mr. Steve Baker to move the motion.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Walker, I beg your pardon. I beg to move that this House has considered the impact of the 2019 loan charge. I'd like to just take a moment to say how glad I am to serve once again under your chairmanship from the back benches. It's right that everyone, both individuals and corporations, should pay the correct amount of tax, and I welcome the government's commitment to a fairer tax system. I was pleased to see that the UK's tax gap has fallen to a record low in recent months of 5.7%. I think I should start by explaining what this loan charge is. The gov.uk website explains. Loan schemes, otherwise known as disguised remuneration schemes, are used to avoid paying income tax and national insurance, government's quote. The loan charge was announced at the Budget 2016. The policy ensures users of tax avoidance loan schemes pay their share of tax and is expected to protect 3.2 billion for the UK's vital public services. The loan charge works by adding together all outstanding loans and taxing them as income in 1 year, end quote. And therein lies the difficulty and the fundamental cause of the impact on individuals and families. In 2005, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, said, "Certainty and transparency are the hallmarks of a fair, effective and competitive tax system. A taxpayer is entitled to know with certainty what he may or may not do in planning his tax affairs," end quote. And this is why I object to retrospective legislation which undermines the rule of law. The introduction of the 2019 loan charge has been beset by challenges, confusion and complications. Over 100 MPs have signed EDM 1239, calling on the government to significantly revise this piece of legislation. And I'm glad that we're meeting today in this well-attended debate to consider the impact of the loan charge. In the 2016 budget, the government announced it would introduce legislation to tackle disguised remuneration schemes. Statutory provision was included in the Finance No. 2 Act 2017, with further provisions included in the Finance Bill introduced after the autumn budget last November, which is now the Finance Act 2018. The government says it will protect £3.2 billion by taking action to tackle both historic and continued use of these schemes, and this is, of course, a not inconsiderable sum. This will include a new charge on loans paid through disguised remuneration schemes which have not been taxed and are still outstanding at the 5th of April 19. HMRC state that the schemes affected by the 2019 loan charge were not and never have been legal. However, this is disputed by the Loan Charge Action Group. And, Mr Walker, I'd just like to refer to a letter by the Chancellor of 19th of this month, published today on the Treasury Committee website. The Chancellor writes, "Finally, I'd like to clarify my comments to the committee in reference to the use of disguised remuneration schemes, which I, the Chancellor, described as tax evasion." He writes, "I should have said tax avoidance, and that, in the government's view, tax was always due." But, Mr Walker, this is a very important distinction, because it's evasion which is illegal, and avoidance which is undesirable, and the unintended, just one moment, an unintended use of Parliament's legislation. And I think in the Chancellor drawing a distinction and correcting the record to say avoidance, I think he has made an important concession, and I give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's making a very interesting speech on this, and congratulate him on securing this important debate. Now, as a former personal finance editor before entering this place, I used to have many inquiries from readers about some of these schemes as they were offered them, and my advice was always steer clear, because eventually the price will be paid. Does my honourable friend agree with me there's a role for regulators to look at the poor and potentially dangerous advice given by accountants around these schemes?
Well, Mr Walker, it is my intention in my concluding remarks to stridently condemn promoters of these schemes who have ended up luring people into misery through what they've done. But I would just want to, before closing with this letter, the Chancellor also said it's not normal or indeed reasonable to be paid in loans that are not repaid in practice. It's not fair to the vast majority of taxpayers who pay their taxes in full and on time for anyone to benefit from contrived avoidance of this sort, and that is why this government has legislated the charge on DR loans. I would agree with the Chancellor that it is not normal or reasonable, but I make it very clear, the blame I place upon the promoters of these schemes. So to go on to talk about the impacts upon people. HMRC initially expected 40,000 people to be affected although in a recent parliamentary question, the Treasury Minister gave a new figure of 50,000 individuals affected. The government anticipates that some of these individuals will become insolvent as a result. The Loan Charge Action Group suggested that it will end up affecting probably upwards of 100,000 people and their families. The member for Eastbourne and Willingdon has tabled an EDM criticising the measure, arguing that retrospectively taxing something that was technically allowed at the time is unfair, and of course I would agree. HMRC has argued that the loan charge is a new tax on a new source and described it as retroactive as opposed to retrospective. And I'd like the Minister, if he can, please, to explain both terms and any difference which the Treasury is inferring. And I'm spoiled for choice, so I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Very grateful for the Honourable Gentleman giving way, and he deserves a lot of credit for bringing this issue to the House. Does he agree that we should be working cross-party ahead of the report stage of this year's finance bill, so we can put together a new clause that would deal with this problem, and so that any loan charge would only come into effect after royal assent of the 2017 Finance Act?
Well, I'd certainly agree with him, Mr Walker, that there is a job of work to be done across parties to uphold the rule of law, and in particular the principle that legislation should not apply retrospectively. This is a subject on which I've made speeches over the years. We end up in a hideous cycle of undesired action, in particular to avoid taxation, followed by the injustice of retrospective action to protect other taxpayers, and then the misery it causes for large numbers of people. And it must be brought to an end, but I think underpinning it, we must be committed to the rule of law.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way and for bringing this debate to the Chamber. Can I ask him about retrospection? My constituent Alan Williams, FCA, points out that HMRC already had sufficient power to recover tax from individuals, and this is rather a matter of their own convenience and their unwillingness to apply their existing powers, which has led to this legislation. And my constituent Andy Pocock points out that in his case, he has got procedures under the existing legislation where he's allowed to appeal, but all this will be cut off by the new legislation retrospectively, and he won't have a chance to fight and defend his corner.
Well, Mr Walker, I'm very grateful. I think one of Parliament's duties is to restrain the executive and to ensure that its powers are reasonable. And I think we should look very carefully at the subject which he's just raised. I do think it's important that HMRC treats people in a decent and civilised way, and certainly more powers ought not to be taken than are strictly necessary. I will give way to him.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and he is to be congratulated on securing this particular subject. One of the iniquities, in addition to the issue of retrospectivity, is that at least 4 of the constituents who've been to see me have said that they were told by their companies that unless they signed these new forms of contractual relationships, they would not continue to work for those companies. Given that, shouldn't HMRC be pursuing the companies and not the individuals?
Yeah. I entirely agree with him, Mr Walker, and I'll come on towards the end of my remarks to the solutions that I propose, but I entirely agree with my honourable friend. If any company insisted upon people engaging in these arrangements, they certainly should share in the responsibility for what they did. I will take 1 or 2 more interventions. I will move on. It's not quite like being a minister, but very neat.
Being very for your time, and I thank you very much for bringing this debate. On that point, my constituent was a civil servant for 37 years. In 2010, his team was stupid from the Ministry of Defence to Hewlett-Packard. He retired in 2013. In 2014, they asked him back to oversee a Ministry of Defence contract, but refused to take him back on PAYE and said they would only do it through one of these vehicles. Should my constituent not have had some sort of comfort in the fact that this was an MOD contract? Surely the government and government departments should look at who they're contracting with to make sure that a man like this in his retirement years shouldn't be stung by this charge.
Well, Mr Walker, I'm very grateful. Obviously, I can't comment on the individual circumstance, but I think it is a good opportunity to draw a distinction between taking people on as contractors and insisting that they end up in schemes which could end up with them using disguised remuneration arrangements. So, it's, on the one hand, contracting is a legitimate way of going about business. but on the other, engaging in disguised remuneration schemes which are aggressive avoidance is not desirable. I give way, and then I will go and make some...
My friend is doing a sterling job in raising this matter in this place. I wonder if he might challenge the Minister on that basis then, as to how many firms have been investigated, how many promoters have been pursued and prosecuted, and how many of those had some link or connection with government contracts or government payments.
Well, my honourable friend has been heard by my honourable friend the Minister, and I join in his call that he should set that out. I will just now make some progress. The Loan Charge Action Group have said that the human impact of receiving a bill for up to 10 years' worth of tax will have a catastrophic effect on individuals and their families, and on who amongst us would it not have a catastrophic effect. They have said, they've gone on to say that we are looking at thousands of bankruptcies, family breakups, suicide attempts, mental illness, unemployment, loss of abode, and more. This is a catalogue of human suffering and misery. In HMRC's impact assessment, they said this package is not expected to have a material impact on family formation, stability or breakdown, end quote. But this, of course, is to look at aggregates and not the impact on the individual, which it seems to me is a common mistake of government. And as a Conservative, I wish to focus on the individual first and foremost, not the collective. I will foreshorten my remarks given the interventions that I've taken. So to come on to some specific complaints, a lack of warning. An FOI request revealed that HMRC have said that they've issued about 23,000 loan charge awareness letters. These only came to be issued in the second quarter of 2018. HMRC themselves have said that 50,000 individuals may be affected, so many will be unaware of the impending charge. The Loan Charge Action Group point out that the opportunities to settle new tax affairs with HMRC ahead of the charge were similarly not widely publicised, nor was the deadline of the 31st of May 2018. And this, of course, leaves people in a terrible fix, although the deadline, I understand, has been quietly dropped. The Loan Charge Action Group suggests that historic users of schemes who left many years ago are probably completely ignorant of this new legislation and will only hear of it after a large bill has been received sometime in 2020. This is a dreadful risk which the government should forestall. Mr Walker, I'm keen to conclude my remarks, so I just will come to some solutions I would ask the Minister to consider. The first, as I outlined in a letter to the Chancellor in September, I propose that there should be clarity about what DOTAS registration means. I think there should be a legally mandated text to accompany every advertisement of a DOTAS registered scheme. It should explain that the purpose of registration is to enable HMRC to identify tax liabilities and recover them when such schemes are proven not to work. It does not imply any kind of legitimacy or registration with HMRC for the purpose of endorsing the schemes. I recommend that when HMRC becomes aware that a taxpayer has subscribed to a DOTAS registered scheme, HMRC should contact them and make them aware that registration has the purpose of enforcement and that it does not convey legitimacy. I do think that HMRC must take into account people's circumstances and that the threat of insolvency should never be used as a kind of extrajudicial punishment, and I will give way.
On the point of treating individuals fairly, it's pretty evident that the people who've been selling these questionable products are not being pursued in the way that they should be. In view of that, would he agree with me that government should start looking at mitigation here so that certain individuals, and I know of a couple in my own constituency, are not bankrupted by this whole sorry affair?
Yeah. His point will have been heard by the Minister, and I would endorse it. So the second point I'd like to make is that the loan charge should apply from Royal Assent onwards. In other words, it should be prospective. This is a case I've made many times and not retroactive or retrospective. The HMRC should be more proactive in advising that such schemes are likely to end in tax charges in the future, perhaps far in the future. More steps should be taken against promoters and introducers of such schemes. They are the ones profiting from this misery. And finally, that the issue of employment status in IR35 requires, at last, action to bring uncertainty to an end. I will, and then I'm going to conclude.
Thank you very much. He mentioned he wanted further action taken against the promoters of these schemes. Would he not also agree with me that we need to take action against the QCs who peddled rinky-dink advice that encouraged many constituents, including some of mine in Orpington, to participate in these schemes in the belief that a QC's opinion rendered them beyond the reach of HMRC?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and I hesitate to trespass far beyond my opinion, my expertise rather. But one of the points I would make is that it's often thought that the opinion of a QC determines the truth, and it is not the case. QCs are there to argue, indeed barristers are there to argue amongst themselves in court, for the court to determine the facts. And I'm often struck that people rely on opinions of lawyers when actually what they need is the judgment of a court. So in conclusion, well, I'll give way to him if he wants.
And on that, this is about the judgment of the court. Does he share my concern that individuals are effectively left without a remedy because sometimes the person who gave them that advice so many years ago no longer continues to trade, and that effectively there is no remedy for the individual, no ability for them to claw back their significant losses?
Well, he raises a very important point, and I think in concluding my remarks I should just allow what he said to stand. I really think that it is perfectly natural for people to want to pay less tax, but I think I would be failing in my duty if I did not say to all those who are paying attention to this debate that when something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And we ought not ever to allow ourselves to be lured into schemes which offer absurdly low rates of tax. But I do save my strident condemnation for the promoters of these schemes who in their advertisements seek to persuade people that this is legitimate activity, who seek to create the impression that DOTAS registration conveys some kind of legitimacy endorsed by the state. This is an outrage because of course it encourages people to participate, and these promoters are frankly wicked. It is a great evil to encourage people into these schemes and leave people in misery afterwards. The final point I want to make in concluding is we must insist on the rule of law. Notwithstanding the wicked conduct of promoters, the greater wickedness in the end is to undermine the rule of law, the certainty that comes from knowing that if your actions are lawful at the time they're carried out, they will not subsequently be challenged through retrospective legislation. I feel most strongly about it. I have done throughout my time in Parliament, and I really would urge the government, whatever evils have been done by promoters of these schemes, to abandon the practice of retrospective legislation.
The question is that this House has considered the effect of the 2019 loan charge. There are a number of colleagues wishing to speak. If colleagues could restrict themselves to no more than 5 minutes, I won't put a timer on. But if we go over 5 minutes, I'm going to have to start reducing other colleagues' time. So I've put the question. I'm now going to call Siobhan McDonough.
Thank you, Mr Walker. And on behalf of all the members in Westminster Hall today, I'd like to congratulate the Loan Charge Action Group on effectively lobbying so many MPs. I wouldn't wish them to think that this is normally the number that turn up to such a debate. So very well done. You have clearly done your members very proud. I'd like to start by emphasising right away that I cannot defend tax avoidance in any form. I strongly believe that everyone should pay their fair share, that there should be repercussions for those who do not. The case at hand, however, is not quite as simple. This is a loan charge that will affect up to 100,000 people, many of whom acted in good faith and were acutely unaware that they were ever doing anything wrong. A number of those impacted were forced into schemes as prerequisites of taking up a job, following the guidance given in good faith, rather than attempting to avoid their tax responsibility. They are being taxed retrospectively for something that was technically allowed at the time. What's more, the 20-year range proposed is usually reserved for blatant acts of criminality. We are talking about life-changing amounts of money. For some people, the sums involved run into hundreds of thousands of pounds. This will lead to bankruptcy. It will lead to mental breakdown. This will and has led to suicide. I'd like to quote directly from the letters and emails sent to me by my constituents so that ministers can hear the reality behind these excessive measures. Mr M describes a dark cloud hanging over his head. I quote, It has been hell, and I have at times considered suicide. It will affect my kids' entire life, in that I will be unable to support them as they grow older, and I may be unable to buy a property for the rest of my life. Mr. M argues that governing with life-changing force and 20 years in the past is nothing short of grossly unfair. It also, he argues, sets a dangerous precedent that HMRC can, where it suits their need, change or create laws and retroactively and aggressively enforce them. Then there's Mr. C, who says that bankruptcy is his only option. He says that he took and followed professional advice and declared his arrangements to HMRC at the time, who did not act. And finally, Mr. L, who describes the impact of the stress levels on his health since he was made aware of this legislation, particularly as he believed this to be a legitimate scheme. He claims that these schemes are still freely available for contractors to sign up to. But my constituents are not alone. The Loan Charge Action Group has conducted analysis of those affected, highlighting that 68% describe depression, 71% fear bankruptcy, 31% fear relationship breakdown, and 39% have suicidal thoughts. This is a policy that will cost lives. Would it not be more sensible for HMRC to pursue the enablers of these schemes, the client organisations, the agencies and the umbrella companies, all who have benefited and who I believe hold the most responsibility? Perhaps they don't, because even the HMRC themselves were using and paying contracts that are now subject to the loan charge, working through arrangements that HMRC now declare to be tax avoidance schemes. Let me re-emphasise, if and when an individual or organisation has purposely dodged tax, they must be penalised. But what strikes me is that HMRC are ruthlessly pursuing hard-working contractors whilst rolling over in the face of obvious and aggressive tax avoidance by so many of the UK's largest corporations. Why did Amazon pay just 1.7 million in taxes last year, despite profits almost trebling to 72.3 million? Why did Facebook pay just 15.8% million in taxes last year, collecting a record 1.3 billion in British sales? Why did Google pay just £49 million on UK sales of 7.6 billion? Richard Murphy, Professor of Practice in International Policy Economy, estimates that such tax avoidance costs the UK around 7 billion each year. That's enough to pay for 180,000 nurses or 150,000 secondary school teachers. Tax avoidance in any form must not be tolerated, whilst the government bankrupts unknowing individuals across the country. Multi-billion-pound corporations make a laughingstock of their tax collection efforts. It's high time these organisations and those who have enabled the schemes described today to pay their fair share once and for all.
To serve under your chairmanship, I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Wickham, for securing this debate, which provides us the opportunity to highlight the devastating impact that the 2019 loan charge is having on many individuals. My constituent who has been affected by the loan is at his wit's end. His family life has been turned upside down, and as he sees it, he has no alternative but to declare himself bankrupt. He is not a wealthy man, he is not a professional footballer, he is an IT contractor. When he and others were made redundant by BT, they were introduced to financial advisors who set up these schemes for them. He and they acted in good faith, only following the advice given so as to be IR35 compliant. Mr. Walker, there are two issues that I'll briefly highlight. My first concern is that the HMRC are pursuing the easy targets. Individuals who have acted in good faith, who are not well off, and who do not have access to their own bespoke financial advisors and accountants. My understanding is that the Glasgow Rangers case, on which the 2019 loan charge is based, concluded that the tax liability fell on the employers. This raises the question as to why the HMRC are not pursuing those client organisations, agencies and umbrella groups who have benefited significantly from setting up these arrangements. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree with me that, and I agree with his focus on the individuals involved, would he agree with me that the retrospective nature of this isn't just for the rule of law in the abstract, but actually undermines their trust and the trust of their families and their communities for generations to come in our government and our legal system?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. He's actually got a crystal ball, and he's foretold the next item that I'll be coming on to. In what has happened, these people have become a target. They're vulnerable people. They're not well paid, and they don't receive many of the benefits or protections that payroll employers do of sick pay, holiday pay, and maternity and paternity leave. I would be grateful if the Minister could advise, in his summing up, as to whether the impact assessment that has been carried out has looked at the personal circumstances of those individuals who are being pursued, as to whether they are able to pay and what would be the impact on their lives. My second point, as indeed my honourable friend foretold, is that the basis upon which the 2019 loan charge has been introduced, and for which many individuals are now being pursued, is that it's retrospective and it undermines the cornerstone of taxation, that a government should not seek to impose or increase a tax charge on income earned, gains realised or transactions concluded at a time before the legislation was announced. I sense I should plough on, Mr Walker, so as to give others an opportunity to come in. What I would also say in conclusion, it is vital that any taxation system is equitable and progressive, and those with the broader shoulders pay their fair share. I will allow my honourable friend from Richmond to come in before I
thank my honourable friend for giving me, and I thank the Chair for intervening in such a magnanimous way. The fact is, it's not just honourable members and right honourable members in this chamber who take the view that my honourable friends have just expressed in relation to retrospective taxation. The current Chancellor of the Exchequer in 2005 said a taxpayer is entitled to be protected from retrospective or retroactive taxation. And of course he was right. What we're seeing today and what we're debating today is retrospective taxation, and it is abhorrent.
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. He's actually reinforcing what is the fundamental fatal flaw of this injustice. What I am concerned about, and I believe all members around this chamber are, is that a group of people, often vulnerable people, have acted in good faith, and they are now being asked to bear an excessive burden which is going to have a devastating impact on their lives and their families' lives. And for that reason, it is very important that we air these concerns to the Minister. Thank you.
Mr Fitzpatrick.
It's a pleasure to see you this afternoon, Mr Walker, and I'm delighted to follow the honourable gentleman from Waveney. And I want to offer my congratulations to the honourable gentleman for Wickham for setting up this important debate. I'm also grateful to the Loan Charge Action Group for their briefing, and to former colleague Greg Mulholland in particular for his assistance in preparing for this debate. A number of constituents have contacted me on this, and I'll focus on the questions they wish me to put to the Minister at the end of my remarks. However, a few comments beforehand. Firstly, on the numbers, of which seem to be in dispute. Several figures mentioned already, 40,000, 50,000, 100,000. If I'm reading it correctly in the library briefing, Mr David Richardson, the Director of Customer Strategy, HMRC, to the Treasury Select Committee said there were 105,000 cases, 80,000 of which are unresolved. I'd be grateful if the Minister in his remarks can clarify exactly what the numbers are. Secondly, in terms of the jobs that some of the victims have, the Loan Charge Action Group refer to this and say many tens of thousands of professionals, contractors, freelancers, agency workers, including social workers, supply teachers, local nurses and doctors who were recommended to use umbrella companies by employers, professional advisors and employment agencies. And for many people, the sums involved run into hundreds of thousands of pounds. They go on to say schemes were and still are legal, and in most cases the motivation behind their use was not to reduce tax, but simply to comply with the poorly drafted IR35 regulations, which 18 years on remain unclear and misunderstood. And certainly the origins do seem to be IR35 regulations, and I've been dealing with cases for constituents on this for the past 18 years. My honourable friend from Mitcham and Morden made reference, as did the honourable gentleman who opened the debate, on the LCAG analysis of the impact, and she quoted the figures of those who are affected: depression, mental health impact, 68%, bankruptcy, 71%, loss of residence home, 49%, divorce and relationship breakdown, 30%, loss of career, 30%, and suicide or self-harm thoughts, 39%. The biggest issue for all my constituents and the Action Group is a matter of the retrospective nature of the legislation, as focused on by the honourable gentleman who opened the debate. This has been raised many times already, and the key question remains about the transparent unfairness of this decision. Constituents have requested that I put a number of questions to the Minister, and I recognise that the Minister is not directly responsible for this issue of policy, but I'm sure he has a briefing which will cover at least some of the questions that my constituents have asked me to raise, because they are quite predictable. There is a number of questions. They say, why did it take HMRC 20 years to take official action? Why did HMRC not email or write to loan users over the last 20 years to ask them to come out of these schemes and the risks associated when they had the information on the yearly individual self-assessment and tax returns? Why ask for 20 years retrospective payment for something which was and is legal? Why an appeal format has been refused to loan scheme users, leaving only costly judicial review as the only alternative which single individuals cannot afford by themselves? Why does HMRC can't just admit that they did not perform due diligence themselves on the loan schemes? Why public sector contractors, when asked to move into IR35 in 2018 to pay the right amount of tax, did not get retroactive tax to pay? And why PricewaterhouseCoopers got away with 35% early discount on a £10 million fine in 2017 for a failed BHS audit? And finally, apart from going bankrupt or committing suicide, how do HMRC expect most individuals to be able to repay such sums at short notice? And the other item mentioned by my honourable friend from Mitcham and Morden, received this morning from the Action Group, is a letter they received which is saying HMRC contractors now being pursued by HMRC due to the loan charge. The Loan Charge Action Group have now discovered that HMRC themselves were using and paying contractors that are now subject to the loan charge. They've been contacted by people who are in the situation. They've been reported to LCAG that they're working on important IT projects for HMRC, which were security cleared by HMRC, and we're working through arrangements that HMRC have now declared to be tax avoidance schemes. So this, in effect, means that HMRC were themselves involved in arrangements that they are now saying, quote, never worked. And the Action Group comment is, this turns this from fiasco into farce. Perhaps the Minister could comment on that. In conclusion, Mr Walker, over 100 colleagues have signed the ADM, has been mentioned. There's clearly an issue the Government has to address. There's massive impact on the lives of those affected, including my constituents. They look to HMRC for fairness, and I trust the Minister's response will indicate that this is a possibility. If it's not, I do look forward to a cross-party backbench new clause to the Finance Bill, which I think, on the basis of the numbers here, would stand a very good chance of passing the House.
Mr Ross Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr Walker, and it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. And I want to congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Wickham, in bringing forward this very important debate, and to congratulate him on being such a champion on this issue, because my inbox and my surgeries have been inundated with people. I represent Aberdeen South. Aberdeen is the energy capital of Europe. It is the hub of our oil and gas industry. And many who worked in oil and gas were actively encouraged by their companies to get involved with such schemes, actively encouraged to set up a personal limited company and to get off the company books. Many did so for many years. Many felt assured that they were being advised by chartered accountants and tax advisors. All was above board. It was their belief that their professional accountant could not advise anything illegal, otherwise their chartered status would be revoked.
Sorry, on that, give way just very briefly.
Of course, yes.
Of course, it's a failure of successive governments.
But in 2011, the government did actually look at this, didn't come up with a definitive answer, and as a result, these schemes proliferated.
I thank my honourable friend for making the intervention, and his point is heard. You're absolutely right, and I couldn't agree with you more. For many, this option seemed to be clearly the obvious choice. And it's the retrospective nature of this decision that is causing great distress. As has been said already in this debate, there is a huge human cost. And I want to take this opportunity to share with the Minister and members here the stories of my constituents. To quote from one, "It's been going on for a few years now and taking its toll on my family, as we are unsure where we'll get the money to pay any outstanding tax. Their bullying tactics in getting you to sign up to pay, and the fact that they demand you to reach a settlement with them, even though we have done everything they have asked and they've still not come back with settlement figures. Not only that, they are saying even if you settle or pay back the loans, there's a strong possibility it won't end there. So we go back to their scaremongering tactics that they've deployed in order for you to pay up front and ask questions later. It's a total unjust for our future as being a democratic society." Another constituent said, "I like to think I understood the risk I was taking and I had every confidence in the scheme I was using. I did not entertain the prospect that the government would be prepared to violate the core principle of the rule of legal certainty by introducing retrospective legislation going back 20 years. This weekend, I have received my settlement offer under HMRC's settlement offer, and I'm currently in the process of deciding whether or not to accept their terms. Whilst I sincerely would like to settle and move on, I am deeply concerned that their CLSO2 is extremely unfair and punitive." Yes, of course. Yeah.
Very good gentleman who's making such a powerful point. Does he agree with me that the fundamental unfairness that many of us feel is that HMRC are going after the easiest targets, namely the individuals, rather than those who may or may not be most culpable?
Thank you very much for your intervention, for my honourable friend's intervention. Again, I couldn't agree with him more. It seems to be easy pickings for HMRC. They're not going after those who truly are culpable, and that's why we're seeing such great distress expressed in our surgeries. The whole sorry affair has imposed life-changing levels of stress on both me and my family, especially with the backdrop of the recent downturn in the oil and gas industry, where I have been out of work for about 50% of the past 2 years. This is a complicated situation. However, fundamentally, HMRC have closed down the opportunity to use these loan schemes. They accept it's a positive move to end ambiguity. But another constituent said that the respective nature of this legislation is going to place a large number of contractors under extreme financial duress, bearing in mind that it's HMRC's failure to sort this situation out sooner. And another constituent, and this is the last example I'll give, emailed me to say that he was emailed by a company stating that he could retain 78 to 80% of his salary legally. The scheme was QC approved, and Top Tax Council advised it was sound. I learnt during the latter part of last week that my retrospective tax charge is very likely to exceed $230,000. As for HMRC's so-called impact assessment, apparently finding that such sums would lead to few, if any, issues for those being expected to pay such. I can only comment that they must assume that we are all multimillionaires. Of course, they know full well that we aren't. It's very daunting when the full weight of government makes demands with threats of the law abiding, brought to bear when, according to the law, no law has been broken. I doubt very much that I can simply ignore threats, be taken to court and stand there and say, thus individuals are placed in the position of hiring lawyers with costs running into 6 figures, and this will be beyond the means of most, if not all of us. This particular constituent says that he is single, that he's never had a second income from a partner to assist with the costs of living, and he is facing serious financial distress. So, Mr. Walker, it's right that we condemn those that sold on such schemes and encourage such schemes. It's deeply unfair that we seek to do this retrospectively. It absolutely violates the core principles of the rule of law. And I couldn't agree more with colleagues who've already expressed that frustration. I think that this particular measure is disgraceful. If I can go even further to say, I think it's dishonourable and it should be stopped.
Just, if colleagues could keep to 5 minutes, we might get everybody in. Mr Davey.
Thank you, Mr Walker. I think this House has the chance and the opportunity to put this wrong right. As my honourable friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, said at the end of his speech, there will be a report stage to the current finance bill. It will come to the floor of the House, and every member here today, whatever party, whatever member who signed the early day motion, we have the power to come together cross-party and pass a new clause to right this wrong. And frankly, words in a Westminster Hall debate, signatures on the EDM, mean nothing unless we're prepared to vote in the lobbies to vote this tyrannous legislation down. And I think constituents and the Loan Charge Action Group and all the people affected will expect their members of Parliament to vote and act and not just to talk. And I think today gives us a platform to make sure we send a very powerful message to the Treasury ministers that this is a catalyst for the action that wasn't taken 2 years ago, that will be taken, I believe, when we get to the report stage of the finance bill. Because, as has been said by the honourable member for Wickham, there is a fundamental principle here, which he and I can agree on, the rule of law. And when we talk about British values, which he and I agree on, the rule of law is something the Department of Education says should be taught in every school up and down our country. Well, this is the test. This is the test, Mr. Walker. Either members of Parliament believe in the rule of law, what our children are being taught, or they don't. And when we come to vote on the finance bill new clause, as I am sure we will be asked to, we will see whether we really do believe in the rule of law.
Liberal to another to agree with the right honourable gentleman, but I hope members of the public won't think me engaging in too much levity if I say some of us are engaged in enough rebellion already, and I should be very grateful indeed if the government were to bring forward its own amendment to deal with this so that we don't find ourselves engaged in any kind of rebellion on the finance bill.
Well, it was a pleasure to allow that intervention, Mr. Walker, and I have no objection about how this wrong is righted, as long as it's righted properly. And to my mind, if we're sticking to the principle of the rule of law, it means, as I said in my intervention to the honourable gentleman, that the retrospection, ending retrospection in this particular tax change, means that any charge prior to the rule assent of the Finance Act 2017 must end. There can be no charges before the rule assent of that Act, otherwise we are in the area of retrospection. Mr. Walker, like other colleagues, I've had constituents contacting me. I believe I've had 16 contact me directly, and in my experience that means there's many more out there who've not contacted me. We can all read their letters. I'm just going to read one from Mr. Gary Taylor, who talks about the devastating consequences that will destroy the finances of me and my family. And I don't know about other colleagues, but I've had people almost in tears in my surgery over a tax matter. That's never happened before in 20 years.
Grateful for the honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he agree that people are living in genuine fear of bankruptcy and losing their homes, and it's not acceptable that the government's handled it in that way?
I couldn't agree more. I've never seen people so distressed and distraught by one particular measure, which appears to be targeting pain on just a few people. Now, these are people who are working hard in our NHS, in our industry, in our schools, in our civil service. Why does the government want to target so much pain on so relatively few people? That means the charges involved are massive, hundreds of thousands of pounds. This is completely iniquitous, and I believe the Minister knows that, and I hope he's therefore going to put it right. And everyone in this House is clear we're against tax scams. We want to close them down. But as other honourable and right honourable gentlemen have said, people being advised to do this by professional accountants. The HMRC appeared to be happy for them to go on. They were notified of these tax schemes and did nothing. And so I have to say, yes, let's
crack down on tax avoidance, but let's not go after victims, people who are just trying to earn a living for them and their family. I will in a second. Mr. Walker, I think I may be the only veteran of the 1999 Finance Bill Standing Committee. I'm happy for colleagues to put me right, but in those early days of my parliamentary career, I had the pleasure to sit on 9 consecutive finance bills that dealt with the early history of IR35. We had huge arguments then that was wrong. There is an inherent issue here that needs to be tackled, but this is absolutely not the way. And the HMRC has got to learn from history. It appears to me to be acting vindictively, because it didn't get its way a few years ago on IR35, because people have found legitimate ways around it. It's coming back and acting in an outrageously draconian way, and this House has got to say no.
Mr. Walker, and I must begin with a little grovelling by apologising in advance that I have to lead this debate for an SI committee. I'm very grateful that you've allowed me to speak, and I'm very grateful also to my honourable friend, the member for Wickham, who's tabled this debate, as I know it's of great importance not just to my constituents but many other people's. Those constituents are concerned about the 2019 loan charge and have tended to work as contractors or freelancers in the IT and professional services sphere. They're now deeply concerned that HMRC's actions over the loan charge will place them into serious financial hardship, if not outright bankruptcy. They suggest to me that they were encouraged by professional advisors or the contracting companies themselves to enter special payment schemes which were deemed legal and allowed for scheme users to be paid in the form of a loan rather than ordinary remuneration. Resulting from poorly drafted IR35 legislation, HMRC now deems such schemes disguised remuneration that amount to aggressive tax avoidance, and they are pursuing affected constituents at a time when many are not able easily to recover their earnings. My constituents fear this action represents retrospective taxation, therefore undermining legal certainty and confidence in the tax system. They are also angry that the charge is being levied on contracting employees, despite a legal case involving rangers which judged the employer liable for any unpaid tax and national insurance. Given that for nearly 2 decades, HMRC appeared to permit tax advisors and accountants to recommend these schemes without penalty, my constituents believe they've been let down by a system which should have alerted them to problems in a timely manner. I've had a one-to-one meeting with the Financial Secretary on this issue in which he set out the government's own position with clarity. I understand that scheme users will now be able to spread any payments to HMRC over 5 years should their taxable income this year be under £50,000. However, my constituents want to know why HMRC is not apparently being more robust in pursuing those tax advisors, accountants and contracting companies who took freelancers and contractors down this route in the first place. One constituent advised me, I decided to contract having been made redundant 3 times from what I considered safe and stable jobs. I have never in my life taken any state benefit. The only and main reason I signed up to this scheme was because I felt that after a year as a self-employed person, the rewards did not justify the risks, and with IR35 insisted upon by my employers, it seemed the only route open to me to improve my take-home pay. He goes on, I am not justifying any shortfall in the tax that maybe I should or could have paid, but government and HMRC allowed schemes to flourish for years without redress. HMRC have now chosen to inflict regular PAYE NI rates, apply penalties and interest for open years, and take no account of holiday sickness benefits, pensions, training, and out-of-contract time that freelancers have to finance themselves. Surely even a concession on the rate being charged under the loan charge would be a fair and reasonable compromise. I must confess, without having access to the precise details of individual tax paid and the specifics of the schemes entered into, I have found myself caught between the concerns of constituents and the assurances of ministers who believe very strongly that these loan schemes represented very clearly an illegitimate attempt to avoid tax. I fear, therefore, that the fairness and legality of HMRC's actions will end up being determined in the courts by those with the tax expertise to look dispassionately at these matters. Nonetheless, I wanted to raise these concerns in this afternoon's debate in my role as a constituency MP, and I would be most grateful if the Minister could address the specific concerns my residents have raised with me today, namely the apparent lack of action towards culpable financial and legal advisors and employers, the calculation of tax owed, and the issue of retrospection in the tax system, which risks undermining wider confidence in the system.
4 minutes, I'm afraid. Janet Davey.
Thank you,
Mr Walker, and thank you for allowing me to speak in this debate. In 2000, the government introduced legislation called IR35, which sought to class many freelancers as employees. It was designed to target disguised employment, and the government wanted to close a loophole that allowed companies to employ people without collecting NICs or paying their associated tax. Unfortunately, the disguised employment was not well defined. While people were engaged on very different terms of permanent employees, it was not clear whether or not they were subject to IR35s. In this grey area, third-party scheme providers began to offer a service whereby contractors became employees of a third-party company who were then engaged with either the agency or client company. Remuneration was paid in the form of loans, often made by an offshore third party. These arrangements were marketed as HMRC compliant and seemed to offer the certainty many were looking for. The government now claims that these arrangements did not work, and while they were within the law, they were not in tune with what Parliament intended. This has led to a series of measures which were designed to recover these funds, which were not originally deemed taxable. This in spite of the fact that those affected with this legitimately completed tax returns, paid their dues and disclosed the arrangements to HMRC. Many within these schemes, including Nick, who is a constituent of mine and lives in Lewisham East, was involved in one of these schemes and is yet to be informed of the amount that he is due to pay. To say he is worried about this is an understatement. He is facing personal ruin, and I've met with him, and Nick has said to me that he is facing personal ruin, most likely bankruptcy, and the loss of his family home. And he feels this will affect him and his family. And while he was recently, he says, while I have recently moved out of financial services, bankruptcy would make me ineligible to work for any financial services companies again, therefore severely limiting my potential employers and employment. To say this causes a great deal of stress, which is an understatement. While I'm grateful to have the support of my wife and family, there are days when I feel hopelessly overwhelmed by this looming over me. Given the vast sums of monies involved and the various reasons and backgrounds for people becoming involved in these schemes, we need to have a sense of where the company's role in this, who provided the contracts, because they clearly have a role to play. I'd also like to know from the Minister, are the time-to-pay agreements going to provide those affected with any kind of practical support in this matter?
Mr Hayes.
The Honourable Gentleman of Poplar and Limehouse made clear that the genesis of this matter was the changes to IR35 in the year 2000, which led to many freelance contracted and itinerant workers ordering their financial affairs, notably for the purpose of paying tax, in a way that they believed and were told were completely proper and in line with that new regulatory environment. Subsequently, umbrella schemes developed as some of those people's tax and financial affairs led them to the point where they became liable for national employers, national insurance contributions. Those umbrella schemes have become mainstream over the subsequent 18 years. The point is that the people concerned were acting very largely in good faith, whether or not the people advising, promoting the schemes were or not. And the architects and advocates of these schemes are the people that the Treasury should be pursuing with vigour and determination. I will happily give way first to my honourable friend.
Is my honourable friend aware that many of these organisations, these advisers who encouraged our constituents who are now suffering so much grief to go into these schemes, are now the very self-same ones who are actually putting themselves forward to give advice to help them address the challenges from HMRC? Isn't that adding insult to injury?
Well, that should be a further part of the invitation that I made via my honourable friend, who I congratulate in securing this debate, to the Treasury Minister who's going to sum up. And we look forward to him confirming that when he comes to the end of this debate. So I have these three. I will very briefly, but I do want to move on because I appreciate the time.
I'm extremely grateful because I concur entirely with the point that actually the real villains here are the companies who missold these schemes in the first place. And it needs to be pointed out, at times, for fees which could only be considered usurious. I have a constituent who, over a 3-year period, paid £138,000 in fees to a company called AM Limited, which, although it's changed its name, is still trading to this day and registered in Panama. And if HMRC were to assist my constituent in trying to recover that money, then he would be much better able to pay his retrospective tax liability.
Mr Walker, as you know, many debates in this chamber as a minister in various government departments. And let me tell this minister this, who is a good and honourable man. When this many members of this House from across the House come together in a single cause, you better take action, because the writing's on the wall, and you've got to see that writing and respond. And I know the Minister will take that in the spirit that is offered to him as a piece of sound advice. Now, let me make 3 recommendations very briefly, Mr Walker, and then I'll draw them to a rapid conclusion. I'd like the Minister to tell us what further impact assessment has been made by scale and detail on families affected by these measures. I'd like him to tell us, give us an estimate of how many people who can't and won't pay will be driven to bankruptcy, and what effect that will have on the revenue calculations that the Treasury has made regarding this matter. And I'd like him, as I've already said twice, but will make no apology for amplifying, I'd like him to tell us what steps he's taking in respect of the architects and advocates of the schemes who have done so much damage. I've no doubt that being a Treasury Minister is about churning figures, but it's also about changing lives. This matter is about the well-being of very large numbers of our constituents, families blighted and faith in fairness ruined. So this honourable gentleman, this good Treasury Minister, this valued colleague and friend needs to see the writing on the wall and take action. Those that don't will woe betide the day that they fail to listen to voices like the voices that have been aired today.
Thank Mr Hayes for his generous and succinct contribution. Last but not least, Justin Madders.
Thank you, Mr Walker. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to, first of all, congratulate the honourable member for Wickham on securing this debate. It's very clear from what we've heard today. This issue has caused much consternation and anguish for many people, and it's right that the airings, the concerns are aired in here. And I, as much as the next person, believe that if tax is due, then it should be collected. Without the ability to raise funds, of course, our public services will grind to a halt, and I'm sure there is unanimous agreement about that. But where my concern lies, and where many other honourable members' concerns lie, is in the way the 2019 loan charge and it's the recovery of it has been handled to date. It does raise questions to me whether HMRC can say hand on heart that all those who are subject to it have had what I would call a fair hearing. And I want to make it absolutely clear, if that following due process the money is owed, then of course it should be paid. However, what I've heard from one of my constituents does not give me confidence that that will be the case. My constituent, Mr Crook, was working as a geologist in the oil industry, where the agreements that are being scrutinised were set up. His work has dried up, and he is now unemployed. He tells me he's not in a position to repay everything he owes, not that he has yet been told how much he owes, and because of the uncertainty and the failure of HMRC to engage with him, he is very concerned about the risk of bankruptcy. I've been in correspondence with ministers and officials asking for someone to look into Mr Crook's case, but I've had nothing back but the standard response. And of course, with Mr Crook understandably anxious about trying to resolve matters, he has contacted HMRC at the email address provided on the 9th of April, the 8th of May, the 30th of August, 31st of August, 28th of September, and also by post on the 2nd of July. He tells me his emails have had an automated response and he's had no response to his letter at all. Yeah, certainly.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's making a powerful argument on behalf of his constituent. Would he, however, share my concern? I have a constituent much like his who has been told that he may have to pay back over £100,000 over the 5-year period, and he's been told that it could cost him as much as £2,500 a month. And would he accept that even where people are still in work, still trying to provide for their family, those sorts of sums are simply unobtainable for most of our constituents and will lead to bankruptcy, whether that's what the government intends or not?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I think there is a lack of reality and a lack of genuine engagement with individuals affected by this. As I've been saying, my constituent has not had a discussion of the sort that my honourable friend refers to, and until he does that, he's in no position to know whether he will be able to repay anything at all. Will there be genuine discussions before these loan charges become due? Is the Minister confident that the Department has sufficient staff and resources to deal with all the inquiries that we've heard about today? My constituent tells me, having submitted his tax returns each year when he was working, they've never been queried. He states that by doing this, HMRC have at the very least implicitly, or if not explicitly, accepted that the monies he's received in the form of a loan were indeed just that. It is the retrospective nature and the long reach of this loan charge that concerns him so much. And to quote him, he says, "We really are normal people who operated within the law at the time, itemising everything on our tax returns, paying benefits in kind on the loans and operating under a registered scheme with a reference number lodged with HMRC at the time." I think I would contrast what he has said with what my honourable friend, the member for Mitchell and Morden, said earlier on about the string of multinational companies who are clearly paying less tax than they ought to. When individuals that we've heard about today have been driven to despair by the sort of hectoring we've heard here, I think it's right that they conclude that there seems to be one rule for the big corporations and another rule for the man in the street. If individuals are made bankrupt, we will all lose. It looks to me like we could be ended up in that situation by default because of the lack of resources and lack of engagement by HMRC. And I would ask the Minister to look very carefully at how the recovery operation is working so we can avoid that. I ask that they act with competence and compassion.
Kirsty Blackman.
Very much, Mr Walker. I appreciate being called in this debate, and thank you to the member for Wickham who has brought this debate before the House. The SNP has, in previous years, raised concerns about the implementation of IR35, and in fact, during the Finance Bill, I moved that a review take place of IR35 and the way that it was being implemented. Not necessarily that it was a bad idea, but the way that it was implemented didn't work for people, and people couldn't navigate the system appropriately. And we raised that in 2016, or I did, and previously my colleagues had raised the issue as well. Mr Walker, I've been approached by many constituents in relation to the loan charge. Some of those that have raised the issue with me were recommended to join the schemes by companies that they worked for, who wanted them to move on to become contractors through these schemes. One told me that there was a presentation given in the company's boardroom by a company that was running one of these schemes, and individuals were encouraged to go along to this presentation and then to transfer into one of these schemes rather than being employees of the company, which is a real concern. I have concerns about the way that this is being implemented in relation to people. So I have a constituent who filled in the details before the 30th of September, as they were requested to do, and has not yet received a settlement figure by HMRC. I have another one who's in the same boat who's been told that they will receive a settlement figure by the 5th of April next year, when in fact the Treasury promised the settlement figures would come by the 30th of November this year. I've also got a situation where those people that are being told now that actually the settlement figures won't be calculated until the 5th of April have also been told that they need to have a payment plan in place by the 5th of April in order to be compliant. Now, if that settlement figure is not going to be calculated until April and the payment plan requires to be put in place immediately, that's not enough time for people to make the decisions that they need to make around these settlement figures. So some clarity around the timelines would be hugely appreciated. This has been a moving feast, and the Treasury and the HMRC have regularly made changes to the dates and the times that people have been required to put in information by. And I think it's really important that that clarity is there so that people know when they need to have the payment plans in place by. It is important, absolutely, that people pay the tax that they owe, but at least one of my constituents is disputing the calculation that has been made by HMRC and has not been given a breakdown of that calculation, so they cannot work out why HMRC have come to the figures that they've come to. There needs to be transparency in dealing with this so that people can understand why HMRC thinks they owe what they owe, and then they can make rational and reasonable decisions around any payment plans after that. I've been clear with any constituent that has approached me and with HMRC in relation to this, that there needs to be a mutually beneficial payment arrangement that needs to be put in place. We cannot have people being made bankrupt as a result of the payments. And in fact, the change from the sort of 12-month period until a 5-year period in terms of payments is welcome. But actually, if you're being asked to pay back hundreds of thousands of pounds and you're existing on job seekers allowance, for example, then it's not possible to pay that money back over a 5-year period. And the other thing that I've been clear about is that I've got concerns about individuals who are being asked to either to sell their family home or to move out of their family home and have it repossessed as a result of this. Now, that just causes problems for local councils as well as for the family, and actually just passes the buck on. I think it would be sensible if HMRC do want to recoup the money, that they were to do it in a way that would mean that people can actually pay it, rather than people having to be made bankrupt as a result. So there needs to be give and take by HMRC, and there also needs to be transparency and clarity around the date.
On that point, I've been grateful for my honourable friend for giving way. Does she agree with me that one of the biggest problems that faces people who have been put into this position is the uncertainty of not knowing how they're going to cope with paying these large amounts back in a period of time when there's been no assistance or any guidance given to them as to how they may be able to pay that over a period of time?
And as I said, it's been an incredibly moving feast in relation to this. HMRC keep moving the goalposts on this, and I think it's really important that there is clarity about the future timeline, that constituents understand what they will need to pay back, the timescale they will need to pay it back, and that they understand why they're being asked to pay back the amounts that they're being asked to pay.
Thank you very much. We will leave 2 minutes for Mr Baker at the end to sum up. I call the Shadow Minister.
For Mr Walker, it's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Today we've heard some really awful stories from my honourable friends from Mitcham and Morden, Poplar Limehouse, Lewisham East, Ellesmere Porton, Easton and others, and I'm really grateful to everybody here who has contributed to this debate and put the case so clearly, because there is absolutely no doubt that small business owners, contractors and others who have used these schemes will be significantly affected by the charge next year. Many are not wealthy people. They didn't intend to avoid tax, and many weren't aware that it was even an issue until very recently. And in some cases, these schemes were just presented by agency as employers as part of a standard contract. Some could lose their livelihoods, some could lose their homes. The schemes we're talking about today are a form of tax avoidance, and it's absolutely right that tax owed is collected. Avoidance shouldn't pay, and that's the principle. But those who are going to be negatively affected by these schemes deserve our empathy and our understanding. And many of the stories we've heard today confirm that some of those who will be affected are vulnerable and caught up in this without initially comprehending what these schemes were all about. If what's been reported is correct, it's an absolute disgrace that hospital cleaners, locum doctors, nurses, council workers, social workers, people who work hard for the public on low or moderate pay were recruited into these schemes by tax advisors and bogus umbrella companies. And it's an absolute disgrace that the government is determined just to take on these individuals rather than those who facilitated this avoidance for profit, those who knew fully what they were doing and did it anyway. If the reports are right, in some cases, nurses or other public servants were made redundant by public sector organisations only to be hired immediately as contractors through agencies who then facilitated these tax avoidance schemes. What action has the government taken against these agencies? Some might say that this was fraud because these schemes were not a genuine way to reduce tax liability. I have to say that I have some sympathy with that. These schemes seem to have harmed many clients, and in my head, I just can't justify a professional tax expert setting up a scheme like this, getting a nurse or a social worker or someone on a low or moderate wage involved in it. And if it isn't illegal for these tax experts to do it, it bally well should be. So I want to ask the Minister a really direct question. If his government maintains that these arrangements were illegal when entered into, why has his government done absolutely nothing about the advisers that recommended them? Does he agree that when advisers promoted these schemes, they were promoting something illegal? The advisers get off scot-free, whilst those who can ill afford it carry the can.
One of the employee benefit trust schemes we're talking about today was created by Deloitte, one of the largest business services companies, and put in place by Deutsche Bank, working with offshore entities in the Cayman Islands that were set up for this very specific purpose. All of this was confirmed by the Supreme Court in 2016, following court rulings in 2014 and earlier. But 2 years on, there's been no investigation, prosecution, no penalty for mass marketing unlawful schemes. No accountancy firm has been disciplined by the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, the professional body. The government didn't even attempt to recover legal costs it spent fighting these cases. Why? So the government's priorities seem clear. They won't go after the enablers. It appears we're talking about advisors and employers who've exploited public service workers, workers who aren't going to be seeing any benefit themselves, and at the same time directly reduce the tax that pays for those self-same public services. It's simply wrong, and it goes to show yet again how absurd, short-termist and unfair the outsourcing and privatisation policies have been. We believe that clemency should be considered when businesses or people are at risk. As honourable members and friends have said today, it isn't going to help the Treasury to recoup losses over the longer term if the loan charge causes businesses to go under next year. And as my honourable friend, if she doesn't mind me saying, from Aberdeen, said, it will actually cost the public purse more if we're having to evict people from their homes and rehouse them again. So I hope the Minister is going to tell us what the government will do to treat everyone involved with compassion and care, particularly those who have unintentionally fallen foul of these schemes, vulnerable people and those on low incomes. Campaigners say the exact opposite, and people are being treated, we are told, with very little understanding or compassion by HMRC. The impending deadline of April next year and the potentially severe consequences for anyone on a low wage who doesn't meet the deadline justify concerted outreach to those who have loan balances outstanding. We can't let vulnerable people who have been exploited end up with massive tax debts hanging over their heads for many years to come. If what we see is bankruptcies, falling businesses, repossessions, even suicide, it will be because this government hasn't done the outreach it needed, hasn't invested in adequate training. It will be because the context for these charges is a cut to HMRC workforce of 17% since 2010, even as they've rightly been asked to do more to tackle complex problems like this one. And we shouldn't let the government's approach to loan schemes distract us from the absolute failure to deal with large-scale tax avoidance. Loan schemes are far from the only form that avoidance has taken in recent years and are small in comparison to the tax avoidance message by the ultra-rich. Labour supports strong measures against tax avoidance. We want the government to go much further. We want the government to go after the enablers, those who knew these schemes were tax avoidance, that they were illegal and peddled them anyway. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Shadow Minister. And this gives the Minister an extra amount of time to answer all the questions he's been asked. And he will leave 2 minutes, because he's very generous, for Mr Baker to wrap up at the end at 3:58. Sorry, yes, 58. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Walker. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I congratulate my friend, the Honourable Member for Wickham, for bringing this debate to the Chamber today. I acknowledge 12 speeches from my colleagues across the House who raised some very, very important issues on behalf of their constituents. And just last Friday, I had some constituents who came to raise this matter with me too. It is, in the course of my response, I hope to address the significant issues that have been raised around time to pay, retrospection, whether HMRC is going after the promoters, the issues raised by my friend, the Honourable Member for Wickham, with respect to the disclosure of tax avoidance scheme, the numbers involved, the difference between retroactive and retrospective, as well as to give some detail on the sums of money as well that we anticipate will be raised through this measure. But it is the responsibility of government to critically assess the impact of any tax reform and to ensure that it's structured and implemented in the best possible way. Very happy to give way.
The government are saying that the loan charges are designed to treat loans as income. And yet, they're also saying that the loans now income, or if they're written off, they will be subject to inheritance tax because the loan will not be repaid. As you know, the numerous courts and tribunal findings agreed that loans were loans, not income. Yet the government is pressing to go ahead with it, regardless. Does the Minister agree that this is completely wrong and unfair?
Minister. Well, in the course of my speech, I will address that point, and I'm very happy for him to come back to me later on if he feels that I haven't done that. I just want to be clear that I'm the Economic Secretary. The Financial Secretary wanted to be here, but he's in the main chamber with respect to the Finance Bill, and so I am in his place. I would like to acknowledge the early day motion put forward by honourable members, which has attracted 103 signatures, and I acknowledge the concern across the House on this matter. I think the concerns expressed are for people who have used a disguised remuneration scheme, who expect to have outstanding loans at April 2019 and will be subject to the charge. I recognise that we need to be clear as a government of why we legislated for this charge, which has royal assent following a full debate during the Finance Bill process in 2016-17. And I will outline the steps the government has taken to help those individuals who may have been affected. The government believes that it is not fair to ordinary taxpayers who pay their tax on time and in full to allow people who have used tax avoidance schemes to get away with it. Disguised remuneration tax avoidance schemes are contrived arrangements that use loans, often paid through offshore trusts, to avoid paying income tax and national insurance contributions. These schemes may have involved provision of a loan with no intention whatsoever to repay it. And I spoke to the Financial Secretary this morning in preparing for this debate, and he said to me, earnings are earnings and a loan is a loan. And this is what this issue really boils down to. I'd be very happy to give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I understand the point he's trying to make. Before he progresses with his speech, could he clarify for the House whether he accepts, as many members of this House have made this afternoon, that those that undertook this scheme did so in good faith, and therefore the people who are ultimately in trouble for this system are those that perpetrated it, not those that signed up to it?
Well, I'm very happy to concede that of the 50,000 individuals who are affected by this, there are obviously responsibilities for those who promoted it. And it is absolutely the case that HMRC are pursuing those individuals. Often they are individuals who promoted the scheme to large numbers of individuals. And there are 5 cases that are currently before the courts. Obviously, that seems a small number, but each individual one would have covered a large number of individuals. And also, there's been a judgment on one of them, and 4 are moving through the courts. But it is not right to say that HMRC is not engaged in those who promoted it. And I take on board well, others did, I appreciate that, that's fair. But what I would take on board is the sentiment of the House with respect to ensuring that HMRC is engaged in those who promoted these schemes, as well as those individuals as well. Very happy to give that.
Can I say that I'm going to be really gentle because he, like I, ain't the real people that were responsible in our retrospective parties for this particular piece of legislation. But I would be really very grateful to him would he take on the responsibility of seeing that we are written to with the action that's being taken on the enablers by this government.
Well, I'd be very happy to engage with HMRC and get a letter that would set out the action that's taken. However, I suspect there may be some constraints around revealing individual live cases, but where data is available, I will make that available to the House. Yeah, I'm very happy to give one.
Mr. Shepherd.
I'm very grateful to the Minister. Could he also confirm either now or in any such letter what the Treasury's objectives are in pursuing these companies? Is it to take retrospective action against them in order to try and recover the great volume of money they receive from selling these schemes?
Well, the objective of HMRC will be to secure the money that is owed as per the rules of the tax system. And they have enormous power to levy charges of up to £1 million against those individuals that are not complying. Now, if I may make a bit of progress, and then I'll be happy to take some more interventions. These schemes may have involved provision of a loan with no intention to repay it, and the recipients of these payments enjoyed them no differently to the way you or I use our normal income, and as such, in the eyes of HMRC, the payments have always been taxable. And these, I've just acknowledged the comments of a number of colleagues who said that the charge on disguised remuneration loans will apply to loans that were made as far back as 1999. It is fair to say that these schemes were never permitted. They were defective going back to then. Very happy to give way.
So we now learn from the Minister that HMRC knew that these schemes were inappropriate from the outset. So is he saying then that HMRC are not malevolent, but indiligent, inefficient, ineffective? But if they'd known this and they were mainstream for 20 years, why are they only acting now?
Well, thank the right honourable gentleman for his point. The point is that every scheme will be taken on an individual basis. They weren't one single scheme that was developed. And it's for HMRC, and they have done, opened cases going back many, many years on some of these disguised schemes, and they will take action as is appropriate. I think that the concern that has been raised in the course of the debate around the issue of not actually determining an outcome, and the concern that I think the Honourable Member for Wickham raised around where a disclosure of tax avoidance scheme has been made, the implication that somehow that is a verification or an endorsement. And I think that that is a misleading misleading perception that has been left. And that is something that HMRC should be accountable for.
I won't be twice on the Minister because he wants to make progress, I know. But I've always regarded the HMRC as an efficient organisation who goes about their business properly. Isn't this about the government? Because the government took a view about all of this, and I suspect that whilst it may be true that HMRC are those implementing government policy, this is really about the government changing its mind, and that's what we're asking for. Really.
Yeah, the government that my right honourable friend was part of, and I believe a minister in at the time that this legislation passed. And but let me just make some progress. Though it does subject these loans to a tax charge, that 2019 charge only applies to current loan balances and does not arise until April of 2019. Recipients of loans can still repay outstanding loan balances in full or settle with HMRC. I'll just make a little bit more progress and then I'll be happy to give way. This means that the legislation is not retrospective because the legislation sets out the intention of Parliament that payments subject to the loan charge should always have been and will be subject to tax. And the announcement at the Spring Budget 2016 by the Right Honourable former member for Tatton provided scheme users with a 3-year period to repay disguised remuneration loans or agree a settlement with HMRC to avoid the charge. I'd be happy to give way.
For giving way. I think nearly 50% of those that are liable for this loan charge have not had any communication with HMRC since June of 2016. Some of those are my constituents. Does the Minister agree that HMRC must accelerate their communications in order to take that cloud of uncertainty away from those that are affected?
I thank the Honourable Lady for that point. There have been 24,000 contacts with HMRC. The number of telephone calls has increased from 2,000 to 4,000 a week, and extra resources have been made available by HMRC. But I'm very happy to take up the individual cases that she may wish to bring to me. So in the view of the government and HMRC, these payments were always taxable as income. And this new legislation reiterates and formalises that stance. Yeah, very happy to give way.
Very generous with his time, but I think that final point just reiterates the issue here. I have constituents who are employed in the construction industry, and they just simply weren't aware when they were taken on by the agencies, the umbrella companies, through which they had to go to access the work. They just simply weren't aware of their liabilities and weren't made aware of their liabilities. And there's just a natural justice issue. This policy is harming people who are not particularly well paid and have done everything right and are being unfairly punished.
Well, I think the issue of an individual's responsibility to settle their own tax affairs is at an individual basis. I think the question that, of an employer forcing an individual into a tax arrangement of this sort, the employer would then be in a liable position. And let me just make some more progress, otherwise, despite the amount of time I had, I won't get to the end of the speech, and I want to address the points raised. So those people who have been involved in any legal action will be well aware that it can be protracted and expensive for all concerned. And agreeing a settlement with HMRC always allows taxpayers to move on and move out of avoidance for good. And in most cases, any users of schemes will be better off approaching HMRC and agreeing settlement rather than wait for the charge next April. HMRC is... Just one moment. HMRC is encouraging anybody who is worried about being able to pay to get in touch as soon as possible. Give way to the member for Orpington.
My honourable friend. On the point of taxpayers wanting to move on, my constituents, several of them, have requested settlement sums from HMRC, but have not received a response, notwithstanding the passage of several months. And this is prolonging their uncertainty and their anxiety. Could he take steps to ensure that HMRC responds to those requests for settlement as rapidly as possible?
I certainly will, and I took the precaution of speaking to the Financial Secretary again this morning, and I'd just like to clarify that in terms of the time to pay arrangements, the 5-year period will automatically be put in place for those who have incomes of less than 50,000, and those who have incomes of larger than that, there is an opportunity for dialogue with HMRC. With respect to individuals who haven't had that settlement made known, then I'm very happy, as we all will as constituency MPs, take those cases up with HMRC. So HMRC is helping thousands of scheme users to get out of avoidance for good. It will consider all personal circumstances, just one moment, to agree a manageable and sustainable payment plan wherever possible, and has recently announced simplified payment terms for individuals looking to settle their tax affairs before 2019. Now, I just want to address another issue of this debate. For those who have opposed this legislation have made claims that the loan charge will bankrupt public sector workers like teachers, nurses and social workers. Now, it's my understanding that 3% of individuals, so 1,500 individuals, will be involved in the health and education sectors. But the scheme, most of the users of the scheme worked in professional services. The average salary was $66,000, and they were earning, obviously wages that were considerably higher than the average annual wage. In fairness, I should give...
Minister, you've got 40 seconds.
I have contacted HMRC on behalf of constituents. I've told they can't talk to me about those individual constituents and they get an answer by the 5th of April. That's not helpful.
Okay, well, I can't obviously respond to an individual's situation. But what I will say is that disguised remuneration schemes are complex and contrived, and as the Honourable Gentleman said, fail the too good to be true test. And whilst the Financial Secretary and I have tremendous sympathy for those facing large tax bills, it is unfair to let people get away without paying the tax that they owe. And there is support for those people who have used these schemes and now find themselves in difficult situations. This requires those affected to approach HMRC and bring this matter to a close. I will now allow my honourable friend to make some closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. And I want to first say that I'm very grateful to everybody who's everyone who's come along to this debate and participated. It's been a debate which I think overwhelmingly has avoided straying into the partisan, for which I've been grateful. I listened very carefully to all of honourable members' speeches. I don't think anyone has stood and sided with those who think it's legitimate to be paid through loans which have been made with no intention of repayment. I don't think anyone stood on the side of that argument. But what I think we have seen here is how people have been drawn or even driven into such schemes. And I think that is, in the end, at the heart of the injustice. And we've heard stories of real human suffering, which would melt any heart, and that is the heart of the problem. So that then comes on really to the heart of the matter of the rule of law. And I have to say to my honourable friend, once again, he's earned my admiration, because he seems to get all the Treasury's toughest gigs. I sometimes wonder if he should have been promoted to Dexu for a little break. But he will have heard,
no, thanks.
he will have heard the response of people present when he explained that this is not retrospective. I really hope that the Treasury will go away and look again at this measure and eliminate retrospection, because when people have acted in good faith under advice and end up subject to injustice, I do think we must uphold this principle of the rule of law. And if some would say they've got away with it, I think sometimes we have to say that while we don't stand on their side, while we accept that it was not Parliament's intent, we respect that there is a price to be paid in upholding the rule of law, so that in the end we can preserve human liberty and justice.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Baker. Order, order.